Okay, so today we'll be covering what exactly is responsive design, the benefits of going responsive, how it's implemented, and then that includes liquid and elastic layouts, CSS media queries, scalable vector graphics, and then I'll be giving you a few workflow integration suggestions. And yeah, okay, so what is responsive design? So responsive design is a strategy that allows page designs to respond to whatever the user's reading or viewing environment is. And it's a way of conceptualizing your content in a way that is streamlined for all the devices that your readers are using. So in practical terms, responsive design is a set of practices in CSS and HTML that allow your page designs to adapt to the end user's device. And it does this using relative measurements, media queries, vector graphics to display optimally. So responsive design as a concept has kind of been floating around for a while. And the first person who really touched on it was John Alsop back in 2000. And I really like this quote because I think it's pretty applicable to print designers and print publishers who are kind of in between print and digital and sort of trying to come to terms with it. So the control which designers know in the print medium and often desire in the web medium is simply a function of the limitation of the printed page. We should embrace the fact that the web doesn't have the same constraints and design for this flexibility. But first we must accept the ebb and flow of things. So hopefully you're all on board for that. So why should we use these responsive strategies? Well, they'll deliver content in a way that looks good and hopefully optimal for your e-readers. It makes your files more flexible to different dimensions and aspect ratios. It anticipates future devices and, again, different dimensions, and attempts to future-proof your design. We say this with a little bit of hesitation, but hopefully with relative units, it will build in a little future-proof with our designs. Responsive strategies allow workarounds for older devices. And hopefully, if you need to recreate ebook files in the future, you won't have to make as many revisions to your style sheets. Okay, so the trend in responsive web design really started in 2011 with Ethan Marcotti's article, Responsive Web Design. And the term comes from a trend in architecture that is really innovative and has structures and spaces that adjust in their lighting and their size relative to the number of people in the room. So he sort of adopted this mindset for web. So he declares, we can design for an optimal viewing experience but embed standards-based technologies into our designs to make them not only more flexible but more adaptive to the media that renders them. And just a little side note, the ebook was a PDF, so it was not responsive, but hopefully they'll be making responsive ebooks now. Okay, so the big takeaways from Marcotti's writing was we can build responsive solutions into our workflow that again allows for a bit of future-proofing. Media queries are a way to inspect the devices and cater our designs to their constraints. We can provide optimal viewing experience for mobile and tablet devices, and using fluid CSS and flexible images are a way to go about it. So there's a big caveat here though, because responsive web design typically allows all browsers to access. It has the capability to access one CSS file for all devices. In responsive ebook design, we don't necessarily have this ability, but I mean, it is an ideal that we can work towards. And not all e-readers support media queries, So for that reason, we're still working towards coming to full responsive capabilities for ebooks, but as I'll explain later, there's definitely some starting points that we can take. And just at the bottom here, I thought that the acronym for responsive web design is RWD, and so I thought we could take on our own and call it RED. And yeah. Okay. So how is responsive design implemented? Pretty much all responsive uses relative units. So the majority of sites will either use percentages or M's as their unit of measurement. And then they'll use media queries to link to external style sheets via HTML or CSS. And you can also include inline media queries within CSS as well. So you can use scalable vector graphics for all screen sizes, and those allow images to scale up or down in size. And then there's also the ability to use JavaScript and jQuery scripts. This is beyond my realm, so I won't be touching on this today, but maybe in the discussion, if anyone has experience with JavaScript or jQuery for responsive design, we can discuss that and maybe get some scripts. Yeah, okay. So what are relative units? Well, you already use them in your CSS every day, so M's and percentages. And then recently in the latest release of CSS3, they've added a bunch more relative units, and those include viewport height and viewport width, and rems, which are relative to the body font size. But for the most part, we'll be talking about M's and percentages. And M's are a measurement equal to the font size of the parent element of whatever you're using, and then percentages are proportional of the containing element that you're working in. So you probably use M's and percentages interchangeably, but I'd like to suggest that you start using them consistently across all or most CSS declarations. And this is borrowed from the web, and so I'll get into the two different types of web design. So yeah, so relative units are better than fixed units being centimeters, inches, things like that, because relative units are always emblematic of or representative of an aspect of the screen size or text, and an element of the page that can either scale up or down, whereas fixed units are fixed in size and you won't be able to do that. And I just wanted to note that pixels are an absolute unit, and I'll be touching on that again later in the talk. So the types of responsive design are liquid or fluid layouts, which are percentage-based, and elastic layouts, which are M-based. So usually when people mean a combination of percentage-based CSS and media queries, there are two types. So yeah, both take advantage of CSS media queries. So liquid layouts are defined by their use of percentages for most of the CSS. And those percentages are defining the width or height of an element containing element. So for example, if you wanted to set an image within a page width of 900 pixels, you would divide the image size by the page width, and that would give your percentage. So this is from the Responsive Web Design book, and this is the handy formula that you can begin your workflow with a pixel grid. This makes it a little bit easier to figure out just initially what those percentages are for your CSS. So in the book, Marcotte says to keep it as a fraction. So So I'm not sure how many decimal points a reading system will read, but just keep those in your style sheets just in case they're needed. And maybe eventually it'll be pared down, but for now, pretty much all browsers, most CSS has a lot of decimal points after their percentages. So when you're calculating percentages, if you go with liquid layouts, it's recommended to comment out your calculations. This makes it easier to go back into your files and see why you have the width that you do for an image or a sidebar. You may not remember 6 months from now when you go into a book and you're trying to change something and you're trying to figure out why, so that just saves yourself time in the future. And then for responsive images, iBooks obviously doesn't allow you to define the width as previous slides show. So you'll include your image as with a width of 100, and then you'll include it in a div that will reduce the size. Otherwise, it will break. Okay, so there are limitations to where you can use percent. Border widths don't allow for percentages, so you'll probably want to use ems. And then most vendors recommend ems for type-related CSS. I think you can use percent, but it really depends if you want to go with the recommendations or not. Okay, so the other type of layouts is elastic layouts. And like liquid layouts, they're defined by the relative unit of the M and use the M for most aspects within the CSS. So the beauty of this method is that when readers increase their font size, all aspects of the design will increase. So if someone has difficulty seeing and they're increasing the font size, they'll also be able to see the images at the same resolution as the text. And this is my personal favorite. This is the method that I use. But the cool part is that it has a history in metal type. So I'm sure you're aware, but the M dash glyph is called an M because it was the same size as a capital letter M, but it also was the same height and width as the font size in points in metal type. So that continues in digital type. So whatever the initial font size is on a reading device, that's the size that the M dash will be, and thus the M unit. So if the initial font size is 16 pixels, then your M unit will be 16 pixels, and 2 M's will be 32 pixels. Yeah, so the thing with M's, just like percentages, is that it'll always, it changes based on the parent element's defined font size. So if you alter the font size of an element, then you're changing the M unit itself. So to figure out how to get back to the standard M value that you've set to keep sizes consistent, you'll need to use this formula. So it's 1 divided by the parent font size times the required pixel value, and that equals the M value. So again, we're using pixels, which isn't ideal, but it does work out when you're doing calculations. So for example, if you had, if your default M size was 16 pixels and you wanted a pull quote with 2 L's at 12 pixels, you would use the same formula, and that would give you an M size of 0.75 M. And again, we're using pixels, but hopefully after you get a feel for this layout, if this is the type of responsive design you choose to go with, then I don't really use pixel as a calculation anymore. I can just sort of go by what I've used in the past and remember those M unit sizes. So there are limitations to the M unit, which some of you are already aware of. In most instances, it's a great unit because, like I say, it scales alongside the text, but this isn't good for white space because it increases your white space on your page. So your columns can get smaller and smaller and things can start to overlap. So instead, it's recommended to use percentages for margins and padding. So as I mentioned, you can use them interchangeably, percentages and M's, but just be consistent in when you use what. That way you'll have sort of a default that you know, oh, I always use percentages for images and I always use M's for type. And that way you're not sort of throwing random units around indiscriminately. Okay, so now that I've explained how confusing it is to calculate M and percentages in some instances, like I said, CSS3 has released the rem units, the viewport height, and viewport width units. So in the future we may be using these, but obviously the rollout into e-readers tends to be fairly slow with these things, but Apple iBooks does support the viewport height unit at the moment. So the reason that I've really hit home with the relative units of M's and percentages is because pixels aren't pixels, and I'm not sure how many of you are already aware of this, but this was really blew my mind when I figured it out. So pixels in your CSS for the most part are no longer representative of the dots on a screen. Instead, they've been scaled. With the release of, I think it was the first iPhone, browsers started to zoom in on websites just so that there was a consistent viewing experience from desktop to mobile. This was before mobile sites and obviously before mobile design. So because of that, the W3C realized that pixels weren't indicative of pixels on screen anymore, so they actually changed the definition. So, so now there are CSS pixels, which are equal to 96 pixels per inch. So 1 pixel equals 1/96th of an inch, I think. It's kind of confusing. So generally when you're writing pixels in your CSS, they are not equaling to a 1-to-1 ratio to the pixels on your device. Then there are actual device pixels, and that's what we assume pixels to be. So those are the smallest element on a device display. They typically aren't called very often in CSS, and I'll go on to explain that a bit more. So for Kindle and Apple, even when you're defining the viewport for fixed layouts, you're really just defining the aspect ratio, and sometimes that makes for a 1-to-1 ratio to pixels, but not always. And then these are just the quotes, because I just wanted to hit home that pixels aren't pixels. So yeah, iBooks uses these dimensions to determine the aspect ratio of the book. It's a bit confusing. So that's why I recommend sticking to relative units. And in instances where you do need to insert a pixel measurement, I recommend commenting out the corresponding relative unit, so that if in the future you need to alter your style sheets, then you can just easily swap in those relative units. Okay, so the other aspect of responsive design, or the other main aspect of responsive design that we're going to be talking about is media queries. So if aspect ratios didn't differ, we probably could just scale our books using relative units, but because of orientation, aspect ratio, resolution, media queries are a way to call specific style sheets that cater to the screen size of your device. So yeah, and if you haven't worked with media queries yet, these are the style sheets that make for printer-friendly versions of printouts. So this is what a media query looks like. This is actually an inline CSS media query, which I'll explain in a minute. But a media query consists of two different components, a media type and a media feature. You do need to have at least one media type. You don't necessarily need to have a media feature, but you can combine multiple media features to target in on specific devices or constraints. So, so media types. There's several different ones in the media query spec, but the only two that we're going to be using for ebooks are screen and all. There's also projection, print, TV, but for the most part, we'll just be sticking with either all or screen. So for media queries, there are different features that will be called along with either screen or all. So those are width, which is the width of the viewport, height, the height of the viewport, device width, which is self-explanatory, I hope, device height, orientation, which is either portrait or landscape, aspect ratio, device aspect ratio, resolution, color, color index, and monochrome. So you can combine media queries in a few different ways. They follow the logical and, or, and not statements. So to combine multiple media features and media types, you'll use the word and. So in the first example, media screen and color. And then any device that adheres to those will read the CSS within the brackets. If you want to have an or statement, so media that is color or a screen that is landscape, if a device subscribes to either of those, then the CSS between the brackets will be used. You can also say what something isn't. So so media that is not on screen and color. So that would be a printout. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that clearly. So one way that this is used is, as I'll explain in a minute, there's a media type for Amazon. So you can say not KF8. So then if any reader is subscribes to Mobi, then that CSS style will be used. And then you can use the only keyword. So if media is only a screen that has a device, a minimum device width of 48 ems, then they will use that style sheet. No other devices or widths can use that CSS. So like I said, Amazon has released a reading system-specific media types. Some of you may already use these. It's a way of calling CSS styles that are specific to KF8 and Mobi. So you can define CSS more in line with CSS3 for the KF8, and then you can use your Mobi workarounds under CSS with the AMZN-Mobi. Those will subscribe to the Mobi platforms. So how do we add media query to ebooks? There's three different ways. This is the first way, which is the same way that we already add existing style sheets, and that's within the HTML. So within an HTML file, you'll link just the same way that you always do, except you'll add the media type, which is media equals, and then you'll add all or screen, and then you'll add your media features. So in this example, I have orientation landscape. So any reader that is in landscape mode will subscribe to this CSS file. Another way to link to external style sheets is within the CSS file itself. So this media query acts as a link, and in the URL passes to the external file that should be used if it's a screen and portrait. And then the third way, and this is my preferred method because it's a little bit easier, is to use inline CSS with the @media rule. So rather than linking to external style sheets, this media query can be added at the end of your CSS file, and only the styles defined within the brackets will apply to the media type listed in the declaration. So in this first one, these the min and max device widths are for a smartphone, and so only this declaration will apply to smartphones, whereas the second one will apply to any screen size that is larger than a smartphone. So vendor and device media query bugs. So for the most part, media queries only really works consistently well on iBooks and with the Kindle-specific media queries. For e-readers that use Adobe's development kit, it usually breaks when the @media rule is in the main style sheet, so then none of the CSS is applied. And then for the Nook, it ignores all inline @media styles. And then with the media features, you can target monochrome, which would be, one would think, e-ink device, but the Kindle Touch does not acknowledge that it's a monochrome device, and it thinks that it's color. So it requires a lot of testing to use these media queries, and you probably only want to do it if you have a lot of time set aside for testing. So when should you use media queries? It's probably not a good idea to just assume that you can use them for every screen size. So, oh, okay, I'm going to use it for mobile, I'm going to use it for desktop, I'm going to use it for tablet, and build your CSS right away with those three in mind. It's probably better for ebooks if you work with where your CSS or where your design breaks down. So if you find that your poetry doesn't look right, then using a media query might work. And I have that as an example in the next file. So yes, the mantra is let your breakpoints find you. And yeah, like I said, don't just plug in screen sizes for your CSS. Instead, maybe figure out what looks bad on each device and then go from there. So if your poetry looks bad, then you might want to target small screens with a media query. You might not, but it is an option. So these are some content that you can chunk out and use media queries for. So lines of poetry, drop caps, small caps, pull quotes, sidebars, images, and captions. And yeah, so media queries are yours to test out. These ones are ones that I've generally had more success with. I haven't really had success with the color ones, and even then the viewport ones are a bit finicky, and I've done a lot of testing with them, but they haven't done as well for me as device width and device height and orientation. And then again, when you're using media features, I recommend using ems there as well instead of pixels, just because it is responsive. However, in my testing, I found that when you scale up in size of your text, your media queries don't respond, or at least mine haven't. So even though I've defined measurements in ems, increasing the size of the text or decreasing the size hasn't changed which media query is called with the width of the viewport or the height of the viewport. So it does require a lot of testing. So a good rule is do as little as possible. And I've taken this from an article on a list apart as well. So rather than use media queries for every issue you encounter, be selective and use it only when something isn't working. And yes, using media queries for everything kind of runs counter to future-proof and device-agnostic ideals that are the foundation of responsive design. So we don't really want to have CSS that has every vendor prefix in it. We don't want to have all of those. But if your design is broken, then they might be a solution for you. And as Baldur Brownson said, the simpler your style sheet is, the less you have to test, obviously, which is a decent motivation to make your styles as minimal as you can. So just briefly, responsive graphics to use are obviously scalable vector graphics. The advantages there are that they can scale up and down in size, and they keep your file sizes low. The drawback is that they don't work for photos. It's mostly for graphics and line art. And then I just wanted to point this out. I'm not really touching on fixed layouts in particular, but the Kindle publishing guideline even recommends using relative units for your fixed layout ebooks. So they say, to future-proof your content, Amazon recommends using percentages or M values instead of pixels or points for positioning text box and regional magnification pop-ups. Specifying text position or font size in pixels prevents the content from scaling to new devices. So I'm not sure how readily Kindle's fixed layout actually does work with responsive units, but it is good that they're looking that way, and that they hope to have their books be responsive even for fixed layout. So if you have trouble getting your ebooks to have relative units for fixed layout, one suggestion is to comment out those relative units in your style sheets, so that in the future, as they say, you'll be able to swap those in easily. So this is my personal workflow. So I'm not sure how everyone else's workflow works, but I start with my EPUB, and then I develop the iBooks edition, and then I'll add media queries at the end of the CSS sheet with inline media rule. Same with Amazon. And then for Kobo, I will remove those, or not include them to begin with. Okay, so some suggestions for integrating responsive design into your current workflow. So start with what you want to achieve with your designs in the first place, and really know what devices your readers are reading on, because that way you can prioritize your designs and make sure that you're spending time on the devices that you know your readers will be using. Even though I despise pixel units, I think it's a good way to measure out your InDesign prior to ebook conversion, because so many of the unit calculators for M's and percentages online are designed for web designers, and so all of those conversions go from pixels to M's or pixels to percentages. So if you ever need to figure out what a percentage is or what the M should be for your image width, then you can use the InDesign rulers and measurements and just punch those into the online calculator and get your relative units for your style sheets. And then obviously you want to stick with semantic markup and have clean CSS to begin with. Be consistent in your measurements. So like I said, if you decide that you're going to use M's for all type-related elements and percentages for images and graphics, then just do that consistently. When possible, use scalable vector graphics because they can scale up and down in size. Define media queries when essential. So, like I said, if you need a fix for a specific screen size, then media queries might be a solution for you. Stop using pixels. Yeah, just stick with relative measurements, percentages or M's, or any that your vendor complies with. So VH units for iBooks if you're interested in that. And then if you need to use pixel measurements, comment out the relative units. And then finally, stay up to date with what's going on with the W3C and their values and units and media queries. Those are the two that I try to stay up to date with. And there was a recent release of media queries, which I'll be putting in the handout. So, questions?
The first question is, if the bugs that you were talking about with media query implementation are all related to the inline@media rules, why do you prefer that method?
Because I've been keeping my workflow separate, because I just find that when I'm in a rush or I'm working towards deadline, it's a lot easier just in terms of adding things to the content.opf file. I'm not going to have to add anything there. I'm not going to have to add anything to the HTML. I'm just throwing that code right into the CSS, and then I'm not adding any media queries, the Adobe Rendering Engine readers.
Second question we have here is, does the Kindle Previewer app reliably preview formatting from @media queries, or do you have to load it onto Kindles for previewing?
I've had success with the previewer, but not for everything. Yeah, so I've
So is best practice still putting it on Kindle devices?
Yeah, yeah.
How does your proposed workflow that you talked about in your presentation work in a sort of a one EPUB for all vendors environment?
Right. One EPUB for all vendors. I guess it's not really possible if you're trying to achieve that, and I know that that runs counter to responsive design. But if you're using media queries, they do break on Kobo. Like when I preview them in Kobo, they'll work, but then they'll break when they're loaded from the vendor. So so I guess it's in those instances you would just have to remove the media queries and then do your best with CSS and relative units.
Just one note here. One of the attendees wanted to point out that there's a pixel to M's converter online. It's called px2m.com.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I have a handout for everyone that has a bunch of different unit converters.
Another question here is a book apart a good resource for knowing which devices use which responsive design elements?
For ebooks, no. It's primarily for the web.
Okay.
Yeah, I think probably the best is the Mobile Reads forum. A lot of people on there have tested different devices, and they'll have some solutions, some known problems.
So another question here is, what works for EPUB 2 in terms of media queries?
So generally, it's not part of the EPUB 2 spec, so I think it just depends on your reader. So I guess I would say iBooks and Kindle apps might use them for EPUB 2.
And this is a follow-up to a previous question. So when you're talking about media queries breaking on Kobo devices, what do you mean by that?
They don't read anything. I've had the app just not open sometimes with testing, or it'll crash. Oh, and there's one other thing that I wanted to mention just in terms of testing. It's something that I've been playing around with and I haven't been very successful, but if anyone else is interested in just testing with media queries and seeing where they get, you can add the meta viewport tag and include either pixel dimensions or M dimensions, and just see if that helps in addressing the media queries with min height or max height and min width and max width. So I can include that in the handout if you want. It's just another component of the page that you can try to test with to see if that helps with your media queries loading.
This is sort of, here's another question that's sort of related to responsive ebook design, but more so the web. And the question is, do media queries work for browsers? And I believe the answer is yes in general, right?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they definitely so for.
Oh, sorry. Reading EPUBs in browsers.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. So. Oh, actually, I haven't tested that. I haven't tested that, but I know that I don't know if anyone watching has played around with the Read Kit, which is readk.it. I just looked into their files, and they're able to preview on browsers as well as within e-readers. I wanted to ask if any of the viewers had played around with JavaScript and jQuery for responsive design, because I know ReadKit is using JavaScript for delivering their books responsively. So I just wondered if anyone had experience playing around with that at all.
Another comment here is that the Readium should handle media queries.